Hi friends, I'm here to talk about the first 200 pages of Infinite Jest, our big winter read. So I'm actually just a tiny bit past page 200, and I just want to mention that this feels a little bit weird and vulnerable maybe to talk about the book as I'm reading it. But I'm going to keep doing it because even though there are a lot of people out there who have read the whole book and have some information and some context that I don't have, I think it's really interesting for people to see somebody's reading process in real time. So let's go. So the first thing I want to do today is address something that I said a number of times in my last video after the first 100 pages, which was that this seems like a really masculine book to me, and I want to talk a little bit more about what I meant by that, because I've been thinking more about it. The biggest thing that it means when I say this seems like a really masculine book is that most of the characters are men and boys. And so if you're going to read Infinite Jest, you have to be willing to spend a lot of time with a lot of men and boys. There aren't very many female characters in this book, at least not yet. And those that there are not really fully developed the way the male characters are. So that's the biggest thing, and that's not a criticism of the book, it's just something that makes the book a little bit less accessible for me. I mean, obviously I'm interested in well fleshed out, interesting male characters, but not so much at the expense of not having any really strong female characters. But there are a couple other smaller things as well that I was thinking about when I said it's a really masculine book. And they're things that, like, I'm sure I'm going to get some pushback on this, but for example, there's a lot of talk about the specifics of drugs and all different kinds of drugs and kind of a preoccupation with drug use. There's a lot of like bodily function humor. Although just as I was thinking about that, David Foster Wallace writes in one point, he's got this really kind of great chapter about what it's like to be in a residential situation where people are recovering from drug and alcohol abuse, and he gives all kinds of examples of what that's like, and one of them is that women are just as disgusting about bodily functions as men are. Or to quote him directly, females are capable of being just as vulgar about sexual and eliminatory functions as males. So, okay, fair enough. And another little thing that I would say makes this kind of a masculine book is also that there's this male character in drag, which, I don't know, I think that's probably less funny to women than it is to men. One big question is, what is this book about? And as of page 200, I really can't tell you yet. I don't know. I don't really know where David Foster Wallace is going with all of this. One of the friends that we're reading with has had complained last week about all these very disparate threads of the story and like, how are these ever all going to come together? And then he said he came across a footnote that talks about the filmography of one of the characters, and it refers to an après-garde digital movement characterized by a stubborn and possibly intentionally irritating refusal of different narrative lines to merge into any kind of meaningful confluence. At which point he said, you know, touche, David Foster Wallace, you got me there. Because obviously DFW knows that he's irritating us and he's going to keep doing it anyway. This is an argument for reading the footnotes. There was a little bit of discussion in our group about whether people were reading the footnotes, and certainly there are some footnotes, like there's a whole long section of footnotes on James Incandenza's filmography, which I didn't need to read in great detail. But that one example that I just gave you is a really good reason for reading the footnotes, because there's lots of stuff kind of embedded in the footnotes that enhances your reading. I'll give you another example, though, of a footnote that I found really interesting. This happens to be footnote number 66. I'm up into the 70s, I guess, as footnotes go. But there's a passage in the book where that takes place at the radio station at MIT. It says there's a character who's a radio personality who does this really avant-garde kind of radio show. And the footnote says some MITs are compulsive about taping the shows and then listening to the musics again and trying to track them down in stores and college archives, not unlike the way some of their parents had killed whole evenings trying to parse out the lyrics on REM and Pearl Jam tapes, etc. And that's maybe not the first reference, but the first moment for me as a reader when I really knew where we were grounded in time. So Infinite Jest is written in the near future, and it turns out in the near future that David Foster Wallace has in mind, MIT students are the children of people who listened to Pearl Jam and REM. So that means that essentially it's set in our present day. That's a great argument for reading Infinite Jest now. The book was published, I think, in 1995, and so we're reading it essentially 25 years on, 96. So reading it 25 years on, we're reading it in that near future. So it's really cool to see how much of what David Foster Wallace imagined actually is our reality. And I want to give you a couple of examples of those things as well. My favorite one is this whole chapter in which he talks about what he calls video telephony or telephony. He's talking about a time in which people are on video calls. Essentially, it's a chapter about Zoom. He says he imagines that eventually culture goes through this video phone phase and then decides they don't want to do it anymore and they go back to preferring audio phone calls. The explanation for that, in a kind of trivalent nutshell, is 1, emotional stress, 2, physical vanity, and 3, a certain queer kind of self-obliterating logic in the microeconomics of consumer high tech. So I could just tell you a couple of things that he says in here that are just spot on. I mean, the thing about emotional stress, I think a lot of us are experiencing Zoom fatigue, as it's called right now, but the stress of being on video calls all day long. He says here, he talks about the fact that when you're on an audio call, you have this fantasy that the other people are paying attention to you, even though you're not really paying attention to them. And he says video telephony rendered the fantasy insupportable. Callers now found they had to compose the same sort of earnest, slightly over-intense listener's expression they had to compose for in-person exchanges. You know, that line just really struck me as very true today. He also goes into this thing about how people want to look better on the video calls, and so they start manufacturing masks that you can wear for your video call, but then the problem is that if you go out in public without your video mask on, you're afraid of being seen the way you really look. So of course he didn't anticipate that platforms like Zoom could actually have some kind of smoothing function built into the program itself, but it's the same idea. So that was a really fun chapter to read in terms of the near futureness of the story. Another one of my favorite chapters so far had to do with this character, Marath, who's an anti-ONAN terrorist, and ONAN stands for something like Organization of North American Nations. It's like an EU type, I think, grouping of the North American nations. And so he's an anti-ONAN terrorist from Quebec. There's this scene where he's sitting on a ridge overlooking Tucson and talking to this spy who happens to be that character who's in drag. They sort of have an understanding that the spy is watching him and he knows it. But the chapter is really about, partly about him talking about your love of country and your dedication to something larger. There were a number of places in this chapter that really struck me, but again, not because David Foster Wallace was anticipating our time in this case so much, as that it just really resonated with what we're experiencing in the United States today. Marath says, "Are we not all of us fanatics? I say only what you of the USA only pretend you do not know. Attachments are of great seriousness. Choose your attachments carefully. Choose your temple of fanaticism with great care. What you wish to sing of as tragic love is an attachment not carefully chosen. Die for one person? This is craziness. Persons change, leave, die, become ill. They leave, lie, go mad, have sickness, betray you, die. Your nation outlives you. A cause outlives you." I'm really interested to see where this storyline is going as well, whether it's going to keep resonating with me in the same way, but I thought that was a really interesting scene there as well. Again, no idea how all these pieces fit together or what maybe larger ideas or themes are going to emerge from this book, but I've got 700 pages to go. Speaking of which, I've realized I have to speed up my reading. I think it's been 2 weeks since I posted my 100-page video, so it took me about 2 weeks to read the next 100 pages. I was thinking of this as a winter read, so I'm going to have to probably double it up because I don't want to still be reading Infinite Jest 14 weeks from now. In the meantime, it's a great engaging read for the winter, although not engaging in terms of being a page turner. Like, it's not a plot that's driving me through, and it's not even really character that's driving me through, although there are some interesting characters in here. It's more just like, what is David Foster Wallace going to do next? That's kind of the driving force at the moment for me behind Infinite Jest. So hopefully I will see you again in about a week. In the meantime, I'll have another regular Better Book Clubs video for you coming out this Wednesday. See you soon.